Hello, I'm John Molesky. Welcome back to another episode of Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Kristie Kenney. She also served as ambassador to the Philippines. Ambassador Kenney is a recipient of the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award and held the nation's highest diplomatic rank of career ambassador in the United States Foreign Service. She joins us today to talk about the aftermath of the U.S.-Japan-Philippines Trilateral Summit held in Washington, D.C. Ambassador Kenney, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be with you and my friends from the Wilson Center.
Well, thanks. We really are pleased to have you here. So let me start with just a general observation about the significance of the meeting and the agreement that emerged from it.
Yeah, thanks. Let me start, if you don't mind, by taking us back on a little bit of history and background.
Oh, no, that's terrific. We love history here at the center. You know that.
Well, not everyone follows these issues perhaps as closely as I do. But first of all, important to remember that Japan and the Philippines are both treaty allies of the United States in Asia. They're among our 5 treaty allies, and they're both fellow democracies. But the relationship, particularly between the Philippines and Japan, we turn back to a time before we were alive, 80 years ago. Japan was a brutal occupier of the Philippines in World War II. The United States liberated the Philippines from Japan. The Philippines had been a colony of the United States. They became a free, independent country upon that liberation. But the Japanese have worked since that time tirelessly, patiently, carefully to rebuild or to build a relationship with the Philippines. And it's been impressive to watch, from going from being perhaps the most reviled country in the Philippines to where we are today, talking about trilateral meetings among the 3 leaders of our countries is kind of breathtaking. And I give the Japanese huge credit for facing this head on, for being honest, for being investors, for offering development assistance, and now taking this extra step. So it's to me really exciting and a real reflection, I think, of the work the Japanese have done to rebuild their relationship with the Philippines. Obviously, the U.S.-Japanese relationship was rebuilt years earlier, and they have now been a close partner and increasingly a global ally. And I think that's reflected in these meetings. And a couple things I'd say about it. Our 3 nations represent 500 million people, billion with a B. So that's a big population swath to have. We're all also, if you will, Pacific powers. The United States, we sometimes forget, has a very large Pacific coast and a lot of interest in what happens in Asia. Japan and the Philippines are both island states. So there's a lot we share in common. And to have these meetings wasn't just a question of the 3 leaders meeting. Last year, 2023, the national security advisors of the 3 countries met several times in person and virtually. The foreign ministers also met virtually and in person. So there's been a lot of work to get to the stage where the 3 leaders sat down here in Washington a little less than a week ago and came up with a pretty ambitious agenda.
So you mentioned that the U.S. and Japan relationship has been growing stronger since the end of World War II, and Americans have a good handle on that. Yeah, well, shifting from that back to the geopolitics, let me ask you about the China and the South China Sea dispute. And in many ways, when you look at coverage from around the world of the summit, it was under the frame of a direct challenge to China. Can you talk to us about that?
So the Chinese have been so aggressive in the South China Sea, using water cannons and lasers on Filipino patrol boats, Filipino fishing boats. And I think that aggressiveness and the concern as to how they might react against others is really what pulled the dynamics for this Japanese-Filipino-American summit. And coming out of it was a very strong statement on abeyance of the rules of law, international order, and a condemnation of aggressive actions by the Chinese in the South China Sea. But there were also a couple of pieces of follow-on, which I think will be not difficult to implement and could have some great benefits for all 3 countries, but probably most significantly for the Filipinos, who are the less developed country of the 3 and the country that feels the most aggression. And so one of those agreements was to continue training for the Filipino Coast Guard capacity building. The Japanese have now donated 12, I think, patrol boats to the Filipinos for their Coast Guard. Remember, the Philippines is a nation of 7,000 islands. So a Coast Guard is really kind of got to be top of their agenda, whether you're talking Chinese aggression or unregulated fishing, search and rescue. And so coming out of this was an agreement to do more trilateral training, very specifically to put Japanese and Filipinos on a US Coast Guard vessel in the near future. The three countries plus Australia did some joint maritime drills, gosh, about a week, 10 days ago now, and they've agreed to do more of that. They've also agreed to a trilateral steering group on maritime security and some enhanced training on maritime law enforcement. The United States has a pretty good history, as does Japan, of unregulated fishing. How do you get poachers? How do you do that? And so all of those things, which I think will not be difficult to implement, will be takeaways going forward. They also agreed to do enhanced disaster assistance, humanitarian training. Both Japan and the Philippines suffer from typhoons on a regular basis. It goes with their geography. And so to work on that, and the United States has agreed, we will pre-position humanitarian relief supplies at various of these military bases in the Philippines. And finally, out of this, the United States has a long agreement with the Philippines on our visiting forces agreement, which governs when we put ships into port, if we do exercises in the Philippines, in Philippine territory. The Japanese are now negotiating and expect to soon sign a similar agreement with the Filipinos, which will allow the Japanese self-defense forces to similarly use ports in the Philippines, again, enhancing that cooperation, enhancing the capacity of the Filipinos, and serving as a force multiplier for all three of our countries.
Do you see great potential in economic growth in the relationship among the nations?
Well, I do. And in fact, the second piece of this was an economic piece, and it is by far the most ambitious sort of economic agenda I've seen coming out of, frankly, a bilateral or trilateral meeting in a while. And I think it will be the most complicated to implement. I'm excited about it because I like the fact that we build a relationship among the three countries that isn't just based on security.
Mm-hmm.
Economics affect every one of us. And to have an economic component, enhances economics for the United States, for Japan, for the Philippines. It brings us all more prosperity. So coming out of that, the three countries agreed to develop a corridor in the Philippines on the main island of Luzon. And in that, they will develop roads, ports, infrastructure, a semiconductor industry. They are looking to build clean energy throughout the Philippines, an innovation economy. And while some of that sounds harder to do, the truth of the matter is Filipinos are by nature extremely innovative. They're creative. And there already are a number of research and design facilities from American companies located in the Philippines, taking advantage of an English-speaking educated population. So I think that's something to build on. And specifically, the three countries called out the semiconductor industry with an idea of diversifying the supply around the world, building resilient supply chains for all of us. But there's also the clean energy component. And I actually ran into the Philippine energy minister while he was in town last week, and he's very excited about it. They already have an extraordinary wind power capacity. Obviously, being a tropical nation, they've got a solar power capacity. And they're also looking at more hydropower and looking to learn from best practices from our three countries on a peaceful, clean nuclear power. So, helping the Filipinos become very solidly a middle-income country. They've got good growth rates, but they really need to build a more inclusive economy and one that's forward-looking, that has more modern technologies, resilient supply chains. So that's all fascinating to me. Now, I know you want to ask, how hard is this going to be to implement?
Well, that's always the challenge, right?
And I think it may be. I've talked to officials, American officials involved, and they say the easy part is that the three countries already have a good business relationship. They know each other well. American companies have been in the Philippines for years, ditto Japanese companies. Secretary of Commerce of the US just led a trade mission out there, trade and investment mission, within the last month. So there's a lot of interest. Again, many American countries are looking at where they can go and diversify overseas. They also say that these projects, while they'll need to be controlled by a steering committee, they don't have to be joint. So the Japanese could invest in a port or a railroad, whereas the United States could invest in semiconductor training for Filipinos. So there are pieces that I think could be quite easily put together. I still think the amount of energy from all three countries and oversight to make sure the projects are complementary, that they link up, that they are within the framework, will be daunting. But there's a lot of good energy behind it, and they're going to have their first trilateral promotional event, if you will, at the Indo-Pacific Business Forum at the end of May. So that'll be a real, I think, litmus test for what is the interest. Are there multinational banks and institutions that are interested in financing the private sector interest? How much each government can contribute? So that's an exciting and ambitious, and if I dare say so, innovative piece of it. I think it may be a lot longer term in terms of seeing benefits than the security side, which I think is quite easily implementable and can be easily built upon.
Yeah, they talk the talk. Now we'll see if they can walk.
Exactly.
Right?
Well,
So,
the devil's always in the details.
Yeah. Well, about that, based on your analysis today, based on the readouts from the three countries, based on reporting around the world, it's hard to imagine a more successful summit than what was just happened. But was there any agenda items? Was there anything left on the table? Were there things that still need to be ironed out at some future time?
That's a great question. I didn't hear of any. I actually talked to all three sides, and I didn't hear anybody complaining. They were all glowing. The Filipino president, who I also saw at the end of the week, was just glowing. It also helped that both sides had bilateral meetings with the United States. And so the Japanese, had a state visit with a meeting, and then the Filipinos had a meeting with President Biden, a meeting with the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, meetings with the Secretary of Defense. So there was a robust series of bilateral. And so some of these issues that I think might not have been in the trilateral agenda were included bilaterally. There are a couple of things that I didn't see included, and maybe that the trilateral isn't ready for those yet. I could see at some point the three countries could harness their collective energy and power to be helpful on other issues. And all three of our countries are very interested in what happens, for example, in Myanmar. Or what if there's a natural disaster in a neighboring ASEAN country? Would the three of our countries then be well prepared after they've done all this trilateral training to assist? I noted the Australians participated in their exercises with the Filipinos, Japanese, and Americans 10 days ago. Is there a role for the Australians to join this partnership at some stage? So I think the future could be quite exciting. None of those topics, to the best of my knowledge, were included. And I think they could be, perhaps, if this becomes a much more regular partnership, as it looks pretty poised to do.